I'll never forget the morning of January 23, 1945, standing on the muddy parade ground at Camp Lucky Strike near Le Havre, watching 600 German prisoners board trucks for their journey to America and feeling tears streaming down my face like I was saying goodbye to brothers instead of enemies. The Norman winter air was sharp and cold, mixed with the salt breeze from the English Channel, and Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade was playing from a radio in the camp headquarters, a haunting melody that seemed to capture everything I was feeling but couldn't put into words. I was Captain William Bill Henderson, 3rd Infantry Division, and after 2 years of combat from Sicily to the Rhine, I thought I understood the clear distinction between us and them, between American soldiers fighting for freedom and German soldiers fighting for tyranny. I'd lost too many good men to German machine guns, watched too many friends die in Italian mountains and French villages, carried too much anger in my heart to ever imagine feeling anything but hatred for the enemy. But what happened during those 4 months at Camp Lucky Strike would transform my understanding of war, humanity, and the difference between soldiers and the causes they're forced to serve. Those German prisoners would teach me that, underneath the uniforms and languages and nationalities, we were all just men trying to survive something bigger than ourselves, all hoping to return home to the people we loved. My assignment to Camp Lucky Strike began on September 15, 1944, after I was wounded during the liberation of Dijon and spent 6 weeks recovering in a field hospital. Shrapnel from a German 80mm shell had torn up my left leg and left arm. Not serious enough to send me home, but severe enough to keep me out of frontline combat while the 3rd Infantry pushed toward Germany. The camp was one of several cigarette camps established in the Le Havre area to handle the massive influx of German prisoners being captured as Allied forces swept across France. Named after popular American cigarette brands, Camp Lucky Strike served as a temporary holding facility where prisoners were processed, interrogated, and prepared for transport to permanent POW camps in the United States. When Colonel James Morrison briefed me on my new assignment, his instructions were clear and reflected the attitude most of us held toward German prisoners at that time. "Captain Henderson," he said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he studied my personnel file, "you'll be commanding the guard force for approximately 600 German POWs. Most are Wehrmacht regulars captured during the Falaise Pocket and subsequent operations. Your job is to maintain discipline, prevent escapes, ensure Geneva Convention compliance, and prepare them for shipment to the States." He paused, looking at me with the expression of an officer who understood the personal cost of this war. "I know you've lost men to German fire, Bill, we all have, but these prisoners are no longer combatants. They're our responsibility. I need an officer who can set aside personal feelings and run a professional operation." I nodded, but privately I wasn't sure I could set aside the anger that had been building since my first combat action in Sicily. Tommy Kowalski from Detroit, killed by a sniper outside Palermo. Frank Murphy from Boston, cut down by machine gun fire in the Anzio beachhead. Johnny Rodriguez from San Antonio, blown apart by a mine near Saint Vith. The faces of dead friends haunted my dreams and fueled a hatred that I thought was justified, even necessary. My first day at Camp Lucky Strike, September 18, 1944, reinforced every prejudice I'd developed about German soldiers. The prisoners were housed in rows of squad tents, arranged in military precision, and they maintained discipline and organization that seemed almost arrogant, given their status as defeated enemies. The senior German officer was Oberst Heinrich Weber, a career Wehrmacht officer who'd commanded a regiment during the retreat from Normandy. He was tall, gray-haired, impeccably dressed despite wearing a tattered uniform, and possessed the kind of military bearing that commanded respect, even from his captors. When I arrived to inspect the compound that first morning, Weber approached me with a formal salute and addressed me in excellent English. "Herr Captain, I am Oberst Weber, senior German officer in this compound. I wish to discuss arrangements for my men's welfare and to ensure proper military courtesy is maintained." His tone was polite but firm, the voice of a professional soldier addressing an equal rather than a captor. It irritated me more than outright hostility would have. "Colonel Weber," I replied coldly, "you're prisoners of war, not guests. You'll receive treatment according to Geneva Convention standards, but don't expect special consideration. Your men will follow camp regulations and American orders without question." Weber nodded formally. "Of course, Herr Captain, but I hope you will understand that these are good soldiers who have served their country honorably. They deserve to be treated with the dignity appropriate to fighting men. The dignity appropriate to fighting men. The phrase stuck with me as I continued my inspection, but not in the way Weber had intended. These good soldiers had killed American boys, had fought for a regime that represented everything we were fighting against. What dignity did they deserve? My attitude began to shift during my second week at the camp, though I didn't recognize it at the time. While reviewing prisoner records and conducting routine inspections, I started noticing details about individual Germans that complicated my simple narrative of good versus evil. Unteroffizier Klaus Müller, a squad leader from Bavaria, had been awarded the Iron Cross for rescuing wounded American paratroopers during fighting near Carentan, risking his own life to carry injured enemies to aid stations. When I asked him about this through our interpreter, his response surprised me. "Herr Captain," he said in broken English, "wounded soldiers are not enemies. They are men who need help. This is what my father taught me before war began." Gefreiter Hans Richter, a young machine gunner from Saxony, carried letters from his mother describing how his younger sister had been killed during an Allied bombing raid on Dresden. But instead of hatred, his letters expressed hope that the war would end soon, so that no more sisters, German or American, would die in the fighting. Feldwebel Otto Brenner, a veteran sergeant who'd fought on the Eastern Front before being transferred to Normandy, told me through our interpreter about German soldiers who'd been executed by SS officers for refusing to participate in atrocities against civilians. "Many of us fought for Germany," he said, "but not all of us fought for Nazis." These individual stories began to create cracks in my certainty about the moral clarity of our conflict. These weren't the fanatic SS troops I'd expected. They were regular soldiers, conscripts mostly, who'd been caught up in something larger than their individual choices. The turning point came on October 12, 1944, during a routine mail call that would forever change my relationship with the German prisoners under my command. Mail delivery was always an emotional event in any military unit, but prisoner mail carried special poignancy because it represented the only connection these men had with home and family. Most letters took weeks or months to reach the camp, having been routed through neutral countries and various military postal systems. On this particular day, Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann received a letter that had been mailed from Hamburg 4 months earlier. As our interpreter read it aloud for official censorship, the content was so devastating that everyone within earshot, American guards and German prisoners alike, fell silent. Wilhelm's wife wrote that their 6-year-old daughter Emma had died of pneumonia during the previous winter. Medical supplies were unavailable due to the Allied blockade, and heating fuel was so scarce that they couldn't keep their apartment warm enough for a sick child. She had died calling for her papa, asking when he would come home to take care of her. Wilhelm collapsed, not dramatically, not with loud grief, but with the quiet devastation of a man whose world had just ended. He sat down heavily on a wooden crate and stared at the letter like it contained words in a language he couldn't understand. Without thinking, I approached him and placed my hand on his shoulder. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it. Wilhelm looked up at me with eyes that held no anger, only profound sadness. "She was 6 years old, Herr Captain. She loved flowers and stories about fairy princesses. She did not understand why there was no medicine, why Papa could not come home to make her well." The other German prisoners gathered around Wilhelm in silent support, but they made no attempt to exclude me from their circle of grief. In that moment, I wasn't an American officer, and he wasn't a German prisoner. We were just 2 men confronting the arbitrary cruelty of war. That evening, I found myself in the camp headquarters, staring at photographs of my own niece and nephew back in Ohio, and trying to imagine how I would feel if they died while I was fighting overseas. The anger that had sustained me for months was being replaced by something more complex, a recognition that loss and grief were universal experiences that transcended uniform colors and national boundaries. Over the following weeks, my interactions with the German prisoners became less formal and more human. During routine inspections, I would ask about their families, their backgrounds, their hopes for after the war. The answers I received gradually dismantled every stereotype I'd held about German soldiers. Oberst Weber, the senior officer I'd initially disliked for his apparent arrogance, revealed himself to be a principled military professional who'd spent the war trying to protect his men while serving a regime he privately despised. He'd been wounded 3 times, had lost his own son on the Eastern Front, and carried letters from the wives of dead soldiers who'd served under his command. "Captain Henderson," he told me during one of our evening conversations, "you must understand that most German soldiers were not fighting for Hitler or Nazi ideology. We were fighting for our comrades, for our families, for our homeland. Many of us hoped the war would end before it destroyed everything we loved." Unteroffizier Klaus Müller, the Bavarian who'd rescued American paratroopers, shared stories about German soldiers who'd risked their lives to protect civilians during the retreat from France. "When SS officers ordered us to destroy French villages," he said, "many of our men found ways to warn the people first, to help them escape before the buildings were burned." These conversations revealed the complex reality of German military service that American propaganda had never acknowledged. These men hadn't volunteered to fight for Nazi conquest. They'd been drafted to serve their country, just as American boys had been drafted to serve ours. The transformation in my feelings became undeniable during the week before Christmas 1944, when the German prisoners organized their own celebration using materials they'd crafted from camp supplies and personal items. They created a small Christmas tree from pine branches, decorating it with ornaments made from tin cans, paper, and thread. They organized a choir that sang traditional German Christmas carols, their voices carrying across the camp with haunting beauty that reminded everyone, guards and prisoners alike, of home and family. But the most moving part of their celebration was a ceremony honoring fallen comrades, both German and American. Oberst Weber had organized a memorial service where German prisoners prayed for the souls of all soldiers who died in this war, regardless of nationality. "We remember Gefreiter Hans Schultz of the 352nd Infantry Division," Weber intoned, reading from a list prepared by the prisoners. "We remember Private Tommy Miller of the American 29th Infantry Division, killed near St. Vith. We remember Unteroffizier Kurt Wagner of the 12th SS Panzer Division. We remember Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the American 3rd Armored Division, killed near Mortain." The list continued for nearly an hour, German and American names alternating, prisoners honoring their own dead alongside the enemies who'd killed them and been killed in return. By the end of the ceremony, there wasn't a dry eye among guards or prisoners. After the service, Wilhelm Hoffmann approached me with a small wooden cross he'd carved from a piece of driftwood found near the camp perimeter. "For your men who died fighting us, Herr Captain," he said simply. "So you know that we remember them too." I accepted the cross with hands that trembled more than I wanted to admit. These men, our enemies, were honoring American dead with the same reverence they showed their own fallen comrades. How could I continue to hate men who grieved for my friends as deeply as I did? The final transformation came during the January 1945 transfer preparations, when I learned that several prisoners had requested to speak with me privately before departing for America. Oberst Weber was first. In the privacy of my office, this proud German officer broke down and thanked me for treating his men with dignity during their captivity. "Captain Henderson," he said, "when we were captured, I expected harsh treatment, perhaps even brutality. Instead, you have shown us respect, allowed us to maintain our honor, treated us as soldiers rather than criminals. This is something I will never forget." He paused, struggling with emotions that had been held in check for months. "I want you to know that you have changed how I think about Americans, about democracy, about the possibility for honor to exist even between enemies. When I return to Germany after this war, I will tell everyone I meet about the American captain who treated German prisoners like human beings." Similar conversations followed with Müller, Brenner, Hoffmann, and dozens of other prisoners. Each man expressed gratitude not just for proper treatment, according to Geneva Convention standards, but for the personal respect and human decency I'd shown them during their darkest period. "You could have hated us," Klaus Müller told me. "We would have understood if you had treated us harshly. We killed your friends, we fought against everything you believe in, but instead, you treated us like brothers. This is something that will stay with us forever." These conversations forced me to confront how completely my attitude had changed over 4 months. I'd arrived at Camp Lucky Strike carrying anger and hatred that I thought were justified by my friends' deaths. I was leaving with respect and affection for men who'd been my enemies, who'd fought against my country and killed American soldiers. The departure day, January 23, 1945, was the most emotionally difficult experience of my military service. As 600 German prisoners formed ranks for the final time, preparing to board trucks that would take them to the harbor and ships bound for America, the atmosphere was unlike anything I'd expected. Instead of relief at getting rid of enemy prisoners, I felt profound sadness at saying goodbye to men who'd become, in many ways, friends. Instead of satisfaction at their defeat, I felt hope that their experience in American captivity would influence how they thought about democracy and freedom during their imprisonment and after their eventual return to Germany. Oberst Weber approached me for a final salute and handshake. "Captain Henderson," he said formally, "the officers and men of this compound wish to thank you for your leadership, your fairness, and your humanity. You have shown us the best of what America represents." Then, dropping military formality, he added, "Bill, I hope that when this war is over, when our countries are at peace again, we can meet as friends instead of as enemies. You have given me hope that such a future is possible." Similar farewells followed with dozens of other prisoners. Wilhelm Hoffmann gave me a letter for his sister-in-law in Milwaukee, asking her to tell German Americans about how German prisoners had been treated with dignity by American soldiers. Klaus Müller presented me with a small carved eagle he'd made from a piece of wood, inscribed with both American and German military insignia, intertwined. "So you remember," he said, "that soldiers can be enemies in war, but brothers in peace." As the trucks pulled away from Camp Lucky Strike, carrying former enemies toward ships that would transport them to American prison camps, I stood on the parade ground and wept openly. Not from joy at their departure, but from genuine sorrow at saying goodbye to men who'd taught me that humanity could survive even the most terrible conflicts. That night, I wrote a letter to my brother back in Ohio, trying to explain what I'd learned during 4 months as a prison camp commander. "Dear Tom, I know this will sound strange, but I'm going to miss the German prisoners who left today more than I've missed anything since this war began. 4 months ago, I hated every German soldier who'd ever carried a rifle. Today I watched 600 of them leave for America, and I felt like I was saying goodbye to friends. These weren't the Nazi monsters we were told about in training. They were soldiers like us, men who'd been drafted to fight for their country, who'd lost friends and family in this war, who just wanted to survive and get home to the people they loved. I learned that German fathers worry about their children the same way American fathers do, that German soldiers grieve for their dead comrades the same way we grieve for ours, that German prisoners could show gratitude and respect to their captors even after losing everything they'd fought for. This doesn't mean the war wasn't necessary, or that the Nazi regime wasn't evil, or that good men didn't die fighting against German aggression. But it does mean that individual German soldiers weren't necessarily evil, just men caught up in something bigger than themselves. When this war is over, Tom, and we start rebuilding the world, I hope we remember that our former enemies are human beings, capable of change, capable of learning, capable of becoming allies and friends. The prisoners I commanded proved that every day they were under American protection. The validation of what we'd accomplished at Camp Lucky Strike came in letters I received after the war ended. The American Red Cross had established a program for exchanging correspondence between former prisoners and their guards, and starting in 1946, I began receiving letters from German POWs who'd been imprisoned in camps across America. Oberst Weber wrote from Camp Aliceville, Alabama, describing how his experience at Camp Lucky Strike had influenced his interactions with American guards throughout his imprisonment. I told every American officer I met about Captain Henderson, about how one man's decency had changed my understanding of American character. Many German prisoners were treated well because of the example you set. Wilhelm Hoffmann wrote from a camp in Texas, where he'd learned English and was teaching other prisoners about American democracy and constitutional government. "You showed me that Americans practice what they preach about human dignity and individual worth. I am using my time in prison to learn about your country, so I can help build a better Germany when I return home." Klaus Müller's letter came from Montana, where he was working on a ranch and learning about American agriculture techniques he planned to implement in Bavaria after repatriation. The American farmer who employs me asks me why I speak so positively about Americans, and I tell him about the captain who treated German prisoners like human beings instead of animals. These letters confirmed that the relationships formed at Camp Lucky Strike had influenced how these men thought about America, democracy, and the possibility for former enemies to become friends and allies. In 1952, I received an invitation that brought everything full circle. Oberst Weber, now returned to Germany and working as a civilian administrator, helping to establish democratic institutions in the American occupation zone, invited me to visit Bavaria as his personal guest. The reunion took place in Munich, where Weber had been instrumental in organizing veteran groups dedicated to German-American friendship and cooperation. Over a dinner that included several other former Camp Lucky Strike prisoners, we discussed how our wartime experiences had shaped our post-war lives. "Bill," Weber told me, "what you taught us about American values during those 4 months influenced how dozens of German officers approached their imprisonment and their eventual return to civilian life. Many of us became advocates for Western democracy because we experienced American decency firsthand." Wilhelm Hoffmann, now a successful businessman in Hamburg, had established a scholarship program sending German students to American universities. "I want young Germans to experience America the way I experienced it, as a place where human dignity is respected, where individual worth is recognized, where former enemies can become trusted friends." Klaus Müller had returned to his family farm in Bavaria, but was also serving as mayor of his village, implementing agricultural and administrative techniques learned during his imprisonment in America. "Everything I know about democratic governance, I learned from watching American soldiers manage our prison camp, with fairness and respect for individual rights." During that 1952 visit, I toured facilities where former German POWs were working to rebuild their country along democratic lines, using principles they'd learned during their imprisonment in America. The irony was profound. Defeat and captivity had become education in democracy, and former enemies had become some of America's strongest advocates in post-war Europe. "You know what I learned at Camp Lucky Strike?" Weber asked me during our final evening together in Munich. "That the most powerful weapon America possesses isn't your industry or your military might. It's your ability to treat even your enemies with dignity and respect. That's what wins hearts and minds, what creates lasting peace." Our correspondence continued until Weber's death in 1973, and similar friendships developed with other former prisoners who'd stayed in contact over the decades. Many of them became prominent figures in West German society, always crediting their American prison experience as formative in their commitment to democratic values and Atlantic Alliance. This was the story of Captain William Bill Henderson, 3rd Infantry Division, who learned that hatred could be transformed into respect, that enemies could become friends, and that the most important victories weren't won on battlefields, but in human hearts. His experience, documented in personal letters and Red Cross records, demonstrates how American treatment of prisoners during World War II helped lay the foundation for post-war reconciliation and alliance. Henderson's account illustrates the power of individual decency to transcend national boundaries and political conflicts. The relationships formed at Camp Lucky Strike influenced not just the former prisoners who experienced American generosity, but entire communities in post-war Germany, where these men became advocates for democratic values and German-American friendship. Bill Henderson's story shows how American principles of human dignity and individual worth, when practiced consistently even toward former enemies, could plant seeds of democracy that would bloom into lasting peace. The tears he shed watching German prisoners depart for America represented not weakness, but the recognition that common humanity was stronger than wartime hatred. What struck you most about Captain Henderson's story? Have you heard similar accounts from family members who served as guards or administrators in prisoner of war camps? These personal testimonies help us understand how individual acts of decency during wartime can have profound historical consequences. If you want to hear more first-hand accounts like this one, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Tomorrow, we'll be sharing the story of Sergeant Major Catherine Angel Mackenzie, who served as a military nurse treating wounded German prisoners and discovered how medical care could heal more than just physical wounds. These voices from the past deserve to be heard. Let's make sure their stories live on.